Class of 2020, come on over here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of recorded music in the late 20th century, especially as it applies to vinyl. This is a jukebox, the Wurlitzer 200, that we got last year on my birthday, and I'm pretty excited about it. One reason we got it was I had so many records. These are 45s. And I didn't know how to play them. You need an old jukebox to play them, so this is it. Might be a little bit loud now. I'm going to turn it down back here. If you want to zoom in a little bit, you can see that 45 spinning right there in the background. The heyday of jukeboxes were the 50s and the early 60s. And there were three companies that made jukeboxes. One was Seeburg, the other was Wurlitzer, and then the other was Rockola. I always thought they were made in Europe because you always would see these in European movies. The Wurlitzer became kind of iconic a little bit later in the 70s when they had a front that was like a racetrack and a lot of neon. You see that a lot in American movies. But anyway, when you had a song, I like these old 50s ones better because you can see the inner workings with the glass, and that was cool. The way that music worked back then is if you were a new band, you could maybe convince a company to put out a single. And the single had an A side and a B side. These are sometimes called 45s because they revolve 45 times per minute. Sometimes they're called 7 inches, but anyway, you'd have an A side, and then they'd say, oh, quick, do another song for a B side. And the B side was often a throwaway song. And then if you had 3 singles that did pretty well, they would say, oh, you have enough for an album. The album was really a collection of songs. It just sort of enough songs. So then you'd go back, record a few more songs, you'd have enough for an album. AM radio was the platform that you would listen to singles. And the singles ruled the day. That's how you made your name with singles. Now, we're going to, these are not part of the machine. These are Devo hats. We are Devo. Okay, let's go over here now to albums. So, it all changed with the Beatles in 1967, and they put out an album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. They didn't have any singles. It was a secret. All of a sudden, they had an album of 12 songs. And when that was released on June 6th, radio stations went crazy. Some of them played them 24/7, the whole album all the way through. And people started saying, this is similar to a symphony. Now you have a new unit of measure. It's not the single and a collection that you put on an album. It's arranging songs on an album, and you have not an A and a B side, but side 1 and side 2. And that pretty much held for about 20 years, from the mid-60s to the mid-80s. And then CDs kind of put an end to that. But let's stick with vinyl. When I was 11 years old, I was collecting 45s. I was not old enough for that 50s generation, but in the 5th grade, I started buying singles. I'd ride my bike down and buy to Lewis Drugstore and buy a single for like 79 cents. And I heard a song when I was 11 years old. It was called Me and Julio, Down by the Schoolyard by Paul Simon. I heard it on the radio, and I got on my bike, said I'm going to go buy that. I went to Lewis Drug. When I got there, I noticed the album was right next to it, and this was the album. And there were 12 songs on here, and so you had an album for $3.99, or you could get a single for 79 cents. I did the math, and I said, I'm going to take a chance, buy the album. It was a good thing for me to buy the album. Oh yeah, get rid of that. So the thing I noticed was that the first side was a lot different than the second side. Now sometimes they put the single on the first side, sometimes not. Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard is actually the first song on the second side. But I noticed a different kind of tempo on the second side and different themes. And I saw that it was really important the way you synchronize the songs. So that's what albums were doing. You would put on an album and you would play it all the way through. FM radio picked up on this and they said, we don't care about the single, we care about album tracks. We're gonna play whatever we like on the album, and sometimes they would play a whole side. I wanted to also say that albums were also referred to as 33s for 33 revolutions per minute, 12 inches. So the 45 was a 7-inch and the vinyl album was inches and also the speed of 33. Now, when I was in college, 45s made a comeback for me. Not for everyone else, but for me. And so I'm gonna walk back over here now. So I was reading I wanted to be a music critic, and I was reading about a new scene in England. It was the punk rock and new wave scene. But we didn't have that in America yet. So I would read in a couple newspapers in London. They would be imported to the record store over in Minneapolis where I was. One was the Melody Maker and the other was the New Musical Express. And then I would read these little album and actually single reviews. These were 45s. And then I'd call up the record store and it would usually take another week. And I would say, did you get XTC's Making Plans for Nigel in this week? Or do you have the Smiths, This Charming Man? Did that come in? There weren't a lot of us, but there were a number of us. So we kind of, now I was not riding my bike, I was taking the bus across town, across St. Paul, Minneapolis, to a record store called Orfolk Jacopus, and one of the great record stores of all time. And we would wait for them to open, and we were so excited to buy these singles. A lot of these over here are some of the singles from that era. So that's why my singles collection was growing and growing and growing. You can play a single over there on the same turntable, but it's just a little more awkward. Okay, thank you. By 1985, the album, as the penultimate artistic form, started its slow decline. And I think there's 3 reasons for that. One is Grandmaster Flash in the Furious 5. He put out a song called The Message in 1982, and that changed the world, brought in hip-hop, and pretty soon the hip-hop artist was someone that cobbled together old forms, made a pastiche out of old beats and new beats, and they became the artist. Also, hipsters started making mixtapes, and they decided that they were the artists, selecting their favorite songs from albums, and mixtapes became very popular. And then ultimately the CD put the album out, and the CD by about 1995. So studies were showing that people were only listening to the first 3 or 4 songs off of a CD, and record companies started telling artists, you've got to put your best songs right at the front because no one's listening to the rest of your album anymore. The attention span of listeners was dwindling. Okay, so now let's go live. I'm going to tell you about our final project. So I know I've simplified things quite a bit for you, and just to wrap it up, I want to get back to the album. I'm not saying that there aren't artistic masterpieces today. You know, you have The National and Vampire Weekend and Kanye and Kendrick making great works of art. But the heyday was 65 to 85. It seemed like your life depended on making that masterpiece then. Your work of art was going to change the world, at least for young people, and the creative competition really spurred that on. The Beatles with the Beach Boys and the Rolling Stones, and you come back west and you've got Jackson Browne and Steely Dan and Warren Zevon, and then you get into Michael Jackson versus Prince and the Replacements and Husker Du. So what I want you to think about as you are resequencing Cosmic Yucca Popquake is the dynamic of the songs and the order in a 35-minute piece, because that's what they're thinking about, not the 4-minute single, but a 35-minute album, 2 sides. Think about the flow and the rhythm of it and how you want to change the rhythm, and maybe sometimes even a throwaway song works as a bridge between 2 songs, and then also the thematic unity too. Okay, thanks for attending.